Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 18 cheat sheet, and obviously the news on Game Week 17 is that it's not technically over. We need to see what happens between Bournemouth and Luton, and I'm not going to talk too much about it because I don't exactly know how that will be addressed or how, for example, the Premier League will even tackle the sort of point situation there. So I'm just going to assume, for example, my rank is such that Dominic Solanke has points, but not his bonus points. So that's my rank right now. As far as the actual state of this game week, what is interesting, obviously, is the impact of that potential abandoned game maybe being replayed in the future. It just means that there could be another double game week at some point for both Bournemouth and Luton. And not only that, but it also adds into the question of whether we should be, let's say, going into Solanke at all. Because obviously, if that gets rescheduled to sometime soon, then of course Solanke becomes a priority asset even more than he is already. And so in the context of, let's say, Game Week 18, there's another little bit of a tidbit that we got from Ben Crellin, who sort of reacted to, let's say, Pep's press conference comments in terms of him talking about a potential match with Brentford after the comeback from Saudi Arabia. So that could be interesting as well, because it just means that there's a suggestion that there could be double Game Week 21 on the cards, even though we previously thought that it would not happen at all. And so looking at that as context, I think it's quite interesting to note that maybe holding on to your transfers until the end of this week makes a lot of sense. Also because we will see what happens in the EFL Cup, and we will also be able to sort of react to that as well before the deadline. The issue, of course, is if, let's say, a double Game Week 21 is announced, it's probably going to be announced on Friday, and unfortunately we do have a deadline on Thursday. So that is the sort of issue and how things stand right now. As far as, let's say, Game Week 18, though, let's quickly move on to the midfielders. I've added Douglas Luiz here. I think he's a perfectly good midfielder. You're looking at someone who effectively could be the penalty taker versus Sheffield United, and that's perfect, right? Because we knew actually that the Douglas Luiz had a suspension last week. He also tanked a price fall. However, he's actually just generally a good pick because you're looking at him as a classic FPL player who, at a ridiculous price point, ultimately is not a huge open play threat, but obviously is crucial to the set pieces of Aston Villa, also crucial to the points getting in terms of the penalties, as I mentioned. So he, for me, is an option where I think if you, let's say, need a stopgap of a transfer, or you're looking at even, for example, free hitting on a Game Week 18, I think he's just fantastic. As far as Andreas, he gets a rise as well. Ultimately, you just have a good run of fixtures here, starting with Game Week 18. Arsenal at home, obviously a tough game in the distance, but generally speaking, Andreas's minutes have improved since his early start in the season. We did see, of course, that he came on injured, from Game Week 1, and that actually hampered his minutes. But so far, his minutes have actually really improved, which is nice. Comparing and contrasting to, for example, someone like Willian, who wasn't utilized at all in some of the recent fixtures. And obviously, I think given that Willian was on the bench for, let's say, a 10 versus 11, it didn't make sense to bring him on at all, simply because Willian is usually utilized when he doesn't need to do much work on the ball. So actually, you could even interpret, let's say, Willian as someone who's being fully rested and very useful for Game Week 18. But I think the long-term effects of that is that Willian might not be fit enough to, for example, see out a lot of fixture congestion. So I guess the question is whether he actually, let's say, plays the full game versus Burnley, but then actually whether he plays versus Bournemouth away at all. As far as, let's say, someone like He-Chan and Tavernier, these are players who obviously have either, no fixtures in the future like He-Chan, or obviously, unfortunately, due to, let's say, that Luton game coming and going, Tavernier isn't that much of a great option now, and you're just looking at worse fixtures, right, for this Bournemouth team. I do think, for example, it's different from, let's say, Solanke, who is in a forward position that is extremely dire. And obviously, the difference between Tavernier and Solanke is the penalty aspect as well as, let's say, minutes, because Tavernier is more of a player who plays, let's say, 78 minutes a game, 82 minutes a game, where Solanke, obviously, you have the full 90 minutes, which obviously makes a huge difference, actually, even though it's not so important, I suppose, when you're looking, 1 week at a time. But in terms of, let's say, being a long-term hold, that is an issue. As far as, let's say, 6.x players, I've actually added Paqueta here. The issue why Kudus, of course, still remains as a differential, even though he just did brilliantly, is ultimately Kudus will be leaving towards AFCON as well. He will be one of those players, so it's almost like a He-Chan position where, of course, these are good assets, but you know that they're going to be leaving the game soon, and you probably would like to sort of make transfers to players at the sort of price point around these players instead, as opposed to, let's say, immediately going out of Saka and Son, or even Salah, for example, players who might not have been delivering that much recently compared to some of these players, but have for a little bit more staying power in general. And in terms of, let's say, players like, let's say, the 7.x price bracket, we have Kulusevski joining, we have Grealish joining as well. I think it comes down to, obviously, the Doku situation with Grealish. He will get a lot more minutes if Doku continues to, struggle with his muscular issue. But if Doku is close to coming back, I think Grealish is not really a sensible option in FPL. And probably, alternatively, on Game Week 21, we could actually be looking instead at Doku, particularly if, let's say, there's a double game week for Man City. As far as, let's say, someone like Kulusevski, though, I think it's just a case where his minutes are so good for this Tottenham team. And we do know that this Tottenham team is still very attacking. And even though he might play different functions for the team, such as playing, for example, like a midfielder or, let's say, a winger, he is still someone who you can get some guarantees from. Because the way Tottenham play, I think, is very endearing towards FPL, particularly if you are invested in an attacker or a fullback. And yeah, that's why I think Kulusevski deserves an inclusion in the cheat sheet, particularly at a time where a lot of the midfielders have been quite lackluster, particularly the high end, for example, threshold midfielders. And I do think Kulusevski deserves a mention here. As far as, let's say, the 9.x and above players, I've only added, for example, a rise for Fernandes. It's just the reality, of course, that he will be penalty taking and, of course, has, better fixtures than, let's say, Anfield. And ultimately, you're looking at him coming fresh off his suspension and being quite a good asset. I think with Odegaard, the reality is actually, since Havertz, for example, acclimated to the team, I think we have seen a little bit of a drop-off in terms of Odegaard's underlying stats. You can see, for example, when you compare, let's say, to Odegaard this season versus last season, that there is a bit of a drop-off there compared to, let's say, Saka, who actually has been relatively improved, right, this season as well. Part of that is also going to be the penalty-taking aspect, but keep in mind that actually Odegaard has taken a few penalties this season, so that actually has a knock-on impact on, let's say, boosting this season's underlying stats for Odegaard. But the fact that his underlying stats in general have dropped suggests, of course, that he has played a slightly different role for this team, and that obviously has an impact. And if anything, we're probably going to be looking at Havertz joining the cheat sheet after this Game Week 18 as well. As far as Salah and in general the Liverpool attack, I don't think there's much to talk about here. Yes, of course, it's been slightly poor, but I still think Salah is probably one of those options that we're probably all going to be persisting with until at least Game Week 20. And that's just the landscape, given that we have so much cash disposable, seeing that Haaland, of course, is out injured and, of course, has a blank Game Week in 18. As far as, let's say, the forwards now, just moving on over there, once again, I think the landscape of the forwards is incredibly dire, where I would only say that we really have 3 or 4 nice forwards in the game, and a lot of them else are differentials. So my issue right now is, of course, Mateta comes in as a new option because we know that Edouard is confirmed to, for example, be injured. I'm not sure how long he'll be out for, but Mateta obviously has played well. He played incredibly well in the City game, could have even drawn, for example, potentially an Ederson red card, and who knows, ultimately Mateta at that sort of price point is a little bit ridiculous because, let's say, comparing and contrasting to someone like Semenyo, probably if he actually becomes nailed is much more interesting. Whereas, let's say, Semenyo, I don't think he'll ever become a player who becomes just a naturally nailed 90-minute player, no matter what the circumstances for Bournemouth. As far as João Pedro, he falls as well. We're continuing to see just a lack of starts in the Premier League, and that's, in spite of, let's say, the Europa League sort of being done and dusted for Brighton for the time being in terms of the group stage position, and obviously the group stages being over. I just think that overall, with the sort of depth that Brighton have coming back, with Matoma, for example, being fit and ready to play at certain stages, that's just going to have a huge impact in terms of how we value João Pedro. So, unfortunately, he does fall. As far as, let's say, the sort of 7.x position, because I don't really think we need to talk much about Solanke and Alvarez. I think with Alvarez, there's a bit of an asterisk with him, right? Of course, he will be a better asset if double Game Week 21 is reality, and he will also be a better asset if, let's say, Haaland is injured for more than we actually think. So those two impacts are very significant in terms of FPL, and we just need to see exactly how, for example, Haaland will be progressing with his injury, how double Game Week 21 might unfold, if it does at all. And in terms of, let's say, Solanke, for example, he just is one of those best picks in FPL right now. Scored, but I'm not sure what's going to happen to the actual goal itself versus Luton Town. Ultimately, he's one of those few picks where he's on penalties, he plays 90 minutes, and you can't actually say the same for any of the players who are really below him in terms of price, and that's really the issue. Another thing, of course, is that we know that this Bournemouth team have incredibly improved in terms of offense as well, which is no surprise because when you actually see, for example, Solanke's underlying stats from this season versus last season, without actually even taking a single penalty this season, Solanke actually has much better underlying stats. So you can see that there's no, for example, bias towards him taking penalties at all. He's actually just in general just being a much larger threat in terms of open play this year. As far as Alvarez, of course, very similar, but we know that there's a little bit of a hidden asterisk here as well because The asterisk I would say is also going to be Alvarez, of course, could be on penalties as long as Haaland persists being out. And in terms of set pieces as well, you don't usually get credited with a lot of expected goal involvement for being a set piece taker, but actually it does, for example, have huge knock-on impacts in terms of FPL. He's also drawn a few penalties this season, and the difference, of course, this year and last year, of course, for Alvarez, contextually speaking, is, of course, the minutes. So that's actually very good, in my opinion, still for Alvarez. As far as, let's say, moving on to the 7.x players, I think you're looking at a lot of players here who have been extremely, extremely unflattering. Darwin and Isaac in particular. Isaac, of course, being mentioned by Howison, who actually was targeted for rest in this fixture. So we need to see what happens in the EFL Cup to sort of accurately determine what is going to happen with Isaac and Wilson. Because I think in the context of the free hit for Game Week 18, actually being able to bring in a Newcastle forward can be exceptionally interesting, right? So when, let's say, Newcastle face versus Chelsea in the EFL Cup, whoever starts in that fixture probably isn't going to start versus Luton away. And I like to sort of look at that as a very, very good maybe guess into what would be the best forward in free at 18. I think, for example, if you went with a two pair, you could obviously just simply go Watkins and Solanke. But if you don't really want to go Solanke and you want to play against the field, you have a very good differential and be able to actually pick someone from Newcastle as your sort of starting striker for Game Week 18, if you can actually confirm and basically have it that they're actually fit and ready to play. As far as, let's say, Nkunku, he's been added back into the cheat sheet. I think also with Jesus, he might also deserve a rise in the future, but I think the concern really with Jesus still is, of course, Liverpool away is an incredibly tough game, and I'm not really going to give him a rise ahead of that game either. So that's the sort of context there. Darwin has been horrible. He's been a horrible own. He's probably going to fall in price this week as well. I think it just makes sense to move away from Darwin. I sort of was eyeing up Darwin as a player who would leave my team on Game Week 20 so that I can move into Haaland. I'll probably persist with that plan if I'm honest, because I'm not that keen in taking hits anymore, at least in the short term. And there just really isn't anyone right now that I think is incredibly pressing outside of, let's say, maybe the chance to go into Solanke. And of course, Solanke himself might have a double game week, but unless that's actually confirmed, I'm probably not that keen on going for Dominic Solanke for the time being. And yeah, of course, with Haaland, we just have to stay tuned with what's going on. They will be traveling, of course, to Saudi Arabia. He will be part of that squad in terms of, let's say, traveling, and the same with KDB as well. But in terms of their actual full fitness and whether they're actually going to play a single game there is probably a completely different question. I think it does make sense, let's say, when you look at the sort of winter schedule, particularly with KDB, who has a little bit more of a long-term injury, that it would make sense for him to actually just play, for example, in 2024 instead of 2023. As far as Haaland, the question, of course, is just how he handles the stress, how his body handles the stress, and, of course, how the sort of physio team will also interpret that. As far as the defense this week, we have a lot of changes and a lot of just movements. I've taken some players out of the cheat sheet as well. I think it just makes sense to have it more condensed to players who would be more permanent assets in your team. As far as, let's say, Konsa and Pau, I just think that these players should be absolutely nailed for Aston Villa. And this is sort of even with the context that, let's say, Cash had a horrible game. Not really a horrible game versus Aston Villa, but ultimately, you can still see, for example, stylistically, that this Villa team, when they actually, let's say, have Diaby and Cash on the pitch, that it's not really, a net positive from a tactical perspective, this sort of structure. And instead, let's say, the sort of traditional four-back where you have, let's say, Konsa pegged a little bit more back, playing right back, seems to actually benefit the team a lot more, where, of course, Diaby sometimes is also hooked off for someone like Bailey, and you actually have a much more stable 4-3-3 sort of structure in place. And so that's one thing to think about as well. I do think my concern really with, let's say, this Villa team right now is not really, let's say, their form. It's just about the minutes of players. And so because, let's say, Moreno and Dean are the high upside fullback assets, it's very hard to say that it actually makes sense to transfer in those two players because, of course, they will be competing with minutes. And I know Moreno, of course, has scored 2 goals in 2 games that he's played, but that's the issue. You can't guarantee because I don't think Dean has been bad at all this season. In fact, he's been a big piece of the squad. And you can also see even from the minutes that he's actually gotten that he's not, for example, someone like Matty Cash who's prone to being taken off at something like 64 minutes. So from my thoughts, I think it just makes sense to go the nailed players. Even, for example, someone like a Villa keeper like Martinez would make a lot of sense. As far as, let's say, some of the changes here, I've dropped Livramento and added Burn. My issue right now with this Newcastle team, I suppose, is that with Botman actually close to coming back, and he is close to coming back because he has been included on the bench at least, and this, of course, suggests that he might be close to being able to actually start a match sometime soon. But that, and for example, the Shard injury doesn't really help Livramento and Burn. I think those two players will be competing for minutes with each other. And Burn, of course, can at times fill in centre back if it's actually necessary. And maybe Livramento could play left back in that situation. But I think you have to, for example, look at Livramento as someone who is unfortunately going to be struggling, right? With Dan Burn back so soon, and with Trippier, of course, coming back after suspension, it's hard to see that Livramento actually has a lot of staying power within your team, because when you look at Newcastle's run, as soon as game week 20 hits, the fixtures actually become incredibly poor. So whilst it's nice to, for example, maybe own Dubravka instead during that period, owning, for example, someone like Livramento or Burn or even Lascelles might not be too helpful, although I recognize, of course, Lascelles is still at a ridiculous price point. As far as, let's say, the 5.x position, I've added Thiago Silva. I just think, obviously, if you're looking at, for example, Chelsea as a team to target, if you want to actually double up on the Chelsea defense, fair enough, then Thiago Silva would probably be the one I would be actually going with. I know Badiashile is interesting at his sort of price point, but I still think that his position in the team is not necessarily secure right now. We could still see, for example, Disasi slot back into a centre-back position, and that, of course, has a knock-on impact on, let's say, Gusto's minutes as well. Whereas right now, we've seen some good performances so far from, let's say, Colwell, Disasi as fullback options. A much more, for example, defensively robust, much more physical team. And it might be the case that Pochettino prefers that, for example, solid spine compared to, let's say, playing someone like Gusto instead. But we'll have to see what happens, because I think Gusto, of course, was someone who actually got very easily into the good graces of Pochettino. And in the context of Reece James being out for 3 months, that probably suggests that Gusto could actually fight for a spot in the team soon. But as I said, you want to go with nailed players during this run, and if you're targeting specifically good fixtures. And unfortunately, with both Aston Villa and Chelsea, I would say there are quite a few attacking fullback options that we can't really trust right now in terms of minutes game to game, particularly if there's a midweek fixture, and that is going to be, of course, the case with game week 18 and 19 specifically, where you might not actually guarantee, let's say, a start in 19, even though you could guarantee a start in 18 with certain players. As far as, let's say, Shaw, Zinchenko, and White, I've actually given them all rises. Ultimately, I think Shaw being fully fit is huge. This United defense, they've definitely overperformed in terms of, let's say, clean sheets and how well they've done just in general in terms of where they stand in the table. But I think Shaw, of course, is a very good asset at any time, really, for United. And in the context as well that Maguire's, let's say, out for any sort of time, I think Shaw becomes even better, because now you actually have only access to Shaw, for a nailed at least Man United player at that sort of price point, as opposed to, let's say, Maguire at a much cheaper price point. As far as, let's say, Zinchenko and White, though, yes, even though we're sort of approaching a very tough Liverpool fixture, I think, depending on, let's say, the Tomiyasu injury, it just means that Arsenal will probably persist with, let's say, playing Zinchenko and White permanently. And that, of course, just means that their minutes are very good. I probably should have already made this change maybe, let's say, 2 weeks ago, if I'm being honest. But I also thought that priority transfers were probably better spent elsewhere, such as in a Spurs defender like Porro, or, of course, someone like Colwell. But now we're sort of looking at, let's say, a landscape where if you, let's say, to sort of decide on which Arsenal player you might actually keep for the long term, I might actually recommend people keep Zinchenko over, let's say, someone like Gabriel, who I would have said is more nailed. And so that's sort of the landscape as well. We just need to stay tuned to what exactly is going on with Tomiyasu's injury. I thought actually it would be a little bit more short term, but it doesn't really appear to be the case. And we'll see what happens, of course. As far as, let's say, Trippier and Alexander-Arnold, I think it's also the reality where now that we actually have much more disposable income in the game for most teams, even on a template structure that includes or previously included Haaland, if you've, let's say, sold Haaland for game week 18 or game week 17 rather, and you're looking at, let's say, game week 20 as a very nice sort of time to bring Haaland back in and to bring Salah back out, then ultimately Trent is probably someone who's going to eventually find his way towards your team. And the same can be argued with the Trippier as well. What's tough with Trippier, of course, is game weeks 20 to 22, as I mentioned, are very tough for Newcastle. But you can also justify maybe a transfer towards Trippier because he actually covers you in the ways that you might need. Of course, 18 and 19. 18, we're sort of struggling with defenders, I'd say, generally across the field. And then with 19, of course, it's just a very good fixture for Newcastle in general. So the question, of course, I suppose, is for managers, what do you actually need and what your priorities are? I might actually be looking towards Trippier myself, just because I'm looking for a little bit of short-term value, and Trippier would be able to give me that. And so in terms of the goalkeepers, just rounding out for this week, we have made some changes here. Not too many changes, really, but we have Martinez, who's been added to the cheat sheet at the 5.0 position. We also have, for example, changes here in terms of adding Pickford back. I think Pickford, it's just undeniable that he's been great, and really this Everton team as well. Even though I recognize that Everton's fixtures are actually quite poor, the reality is he shouldn't be priced at 4.4. I kind of find it weird that people haven't been buying Trippier or buying Pickford back, but I myself in a similar situation, having the chance to, for example, move into Dubravka instead was something that I approached. And as opposed to going for Pickford, who has 4 clean sheets in 4 games, and also got in a multitude of points after I sold him a Game Week 8 wildcard, we just have to say that Everton looked like the real deal. And the underlying stats really back that, compared to, let's say, a team like United, who sit very high up on the league table, but actually still look like a pretty paltry defense. As far as, let's say, players like Raya, I still think still fantastic. No surprise, of course, that Arsenal were able to get a clean sheet versus Brighton, even despite, let's say, losing a few clean sheets and obviously seeing a couple of Raya mistakes lately. I think it's very clear that Arteta still has a preference for Raya, and that's not going to change. As far as, let's say, Arsenal's defense, as I said, they very much still look like the best defense in the world. And part of that is the context of, let's say, City actually looking a little bit worse for wear than they previously have. And things might change, obviously, after they come back from Saudi Arabia. But that's sort of the landscape right now in FPL. As far as, let's say, Sanchez, the issue, of course, is his injury. We're not exactly sure how long that is. As far as Leno, he's fantastic for Game Week 18. I might even consider him to be the best free at 18 Game Week 18 keeper. As far as, let's say, Martinez, Alisson, Ederson, I don't really think there's too much to, let's say, change between them. I think Liverpool are still probably a slightly better defense than Aston Villa, even though I know Aston Villa have had some massive results as of late. With Ederson, of course, you're sort of investing into the potential chance or just simply getting a player who would be able to benefit you in terms of double game week 21. But I know a lot of people would have reservations about going into Ederson in general, and that's fair enough. As far as, let's say, spending money on Flecken for the double game week 21, I just don't think it's worth it, because I think Flecken is pretty horrible as a goalkeeper, and I think Brentford have really, really dropped off since sort of bringing him into the team. There's clearly a big loss of, let's say, Raya being felt there. And yeah, given that you still have Dubravka still starting games for Newcastle, I think it's very hard to see, past, let's say, owning players at cheaper prices like Pickford, Raya, and Dubravka, or even Leno, for example, who maybe deserves to also be in that top tier, but is also quite expensive right now too, in the context of Fulham match, he's still being a bottom half defense. So those are my thoughts right now in terms of Game Week 18 and the cheat sheet. I recognize, of course, a lot of people will be free hitting as well, so I will be dropping a video on a free hit drop that I think would actually make a lot of sense for FPL managers. Other than that, I'd like to see you guys very soon, and take care. Hope you guys get the points that you wanted in terms of Game Week 18, or have some nice auto subs if that eventuality comes about. But otherwise, as I said, see you soon.